The notification came through at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and I almost missed it because I'd been awake since 4, reworking a pitch deck for a client in Singapore. It was a LinkedIn message from my cousin Bradford. Not a text, not a call. LinkedIn, which told me everything I needed to know about the tone of what was coming. Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up. Grandma Eloise is turning 75 next month. The whole family's doing a big thing at Uncle Ray's place in Scottsdale. Mom really wants you there. I think it would mean a lot to Grandma. I stared at the screen for a long time. Bradford and I had grown up 3 houses apart in the same suburb of Columbus. We'd ridden the same school bus for 6 years, and now he was messaging me on LinkedIn like I was a vendor he was trying to loop in on a project. I knew what this really was. I knew whose idea it had been to send that message, and I knew it wasn't Bradford's. I set my phone face down and went back to the pitch deck. Let me back up, because the story doesn't make sense without the context, and the context goes back about 8 years. I was 24 when I left my job at the marketing firm. I'd been there 2 years, which was long enough to know that I was good at it, and short enough that nobody had started depending on me. I gave 4 weeks' notice, saved up 6 months of expenses, and told my family I was going to start my own digital marketing consultancy. My mother was cautious, but supportive. She asked good questions about my plan and then said she believed in me. My father said almost nothing, which for him meant he was processing, and by the following week he'd called me twice just to check in, which is as close to cheerleading as he gets. And then there was my Aunt Phyllis. Aunt Phyllis is my mother's older sister, which means she has about 40 years of practice at knowing better than everyone around her. She'd married well. Her husband, my Uncle Dennis, had spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder at a regional insurance company and retired as a senior VP with a pension and a golf membership, and a lot of opinions about the right way to do things. They lived in a large house in Scottsdale with a pool and an outdoor kitchen and a room dedicated entirely to Bradford's athletic trophies. Even though Bradford was 32 years old and had not played competitive soccer in a decade. When she heard I was leaving my job, she called my mother. I wasn't on the call, but my mother told me about it afterward, in the careful way she has of relaying information she knows will sting. Phyllis had said she was worried, that I was throwing away a real opportunity, that it was one thing to have creative interests, but another thing entirely to try to build a business out of them. She'd said, and this is the part my mother hesitated before repeating, that she hoped I had a backup plan, because most of these little freelance things don't go anywhere, and the last thing we want is for her to end up struggling. She said we, like my future was a collective concern she'd taken on personally. I was 24. I had a laptop and a client list and a very specific idea of what I wanted to build, and somehow that translated in Phyllis's mind into a cautionary tale she was already preparing to tell. The first 2 years were genuinely hard. I'm not going to pretend otherwise because I think that's important to say. There were months where I was billing 40 hours a week and collecting maybe half of what I invoiced because clients paid late or disputed things or just disappeared. There were months where I moved expenses around on my spreadsheet like a puzzle I was trying to solve. I ate a lot of pasta and I skipped a lot of things I couldn't afford, and I did not tell my family any of this because I knew exactly what Phyllis would do with that information. She would have been concerned. She would have called my mother. And eventually, at whatever family function came next, she would have found a way to bring it up in front of everyone, wrapped in the language of love and worry, with Bradford standing nearby looking appropriately sympathetic. Bradford, by the time I was in my second year of struggle, had just been promoted to district manager at the company he'd joined straight out of college. Phyllis had thrown him a party. There were photos on Facebook. There was a cake with his new title written on it in blue frosting. I remember looking at those photos at midnight while I was waiting for a proposal to export, eating cereal out of the box, and feeling something that wasn't quite jealousy. It was more like bewilderment. Like I was watching a game being played by rules I'd never agreed to. By year 3, things shifted. I'd landed 2 anchor clients, a mid-size e-commerce brand out of Austin and a B2B software company in Chicago, and they were the kind of clients who paid on time, gave clear feedback, and referred other people. I hired my first contractor, then a second. By year 4, I had 6 people working with me on a project basis, and I'd started turning down work because I didn't have capacity for it. I did not announce any of this. My mother knew because my mother asks, and because I tell her things I don't tell other people. My father knew in the way fathers know things, through the fact that I'd stopped seeming stressed when they called me, that I'd started being able to meet them for dinner without checking my phone every 7 minutes. Phyllis did not know. Phyllis knew what she'd decided to know, which was that I ran a little freelance operation, that I worked from home, and that I was still, in some essential way, a cautionary tale she was holding in reserve. At Christmas 2 years earlier, she'd asked me, in front of my grandmother, my uncle, Bradford, and Bradford's girlfriend at the time, whether I'd thought about going back to a real company. Whether I missed the stability. She'd said it the way you might ask someone who'd had a recent health scare whether they'd considered cutting back on stress. I'd said I was doing fine, thank you. She'd said, "Well, that's wonderful, we just want to make sure you're okay," and she'd touched my arm. And Bradford had nodded in a way that was either sympathy or the absence of anything better to do. That had been Christmas. The following April, Bradford was promoted again. Regional director. There was another party. Another Facebook post. Phyllis had written, "So proud of this one. This is what hard work looks like." I had, that same week, signed a contract with a national retail brand that was our largest engagement to date. I told no one in the family except my mother, who took me to lunch to celebrate and cried a little, which she would absolutely deny if you asked her. The LinkedIn message sat on my phone for 4 days before I responded. I knew I should probably just say yes. Grandma Eloise was turning 75, and she was one of the people in my life I'd never wanted to disappoint. She'd been quietly, consistently proud of me in the way that only grandmothers who've seen enough of life can be. Not because she fully understood what I did, but because she told me once, while we were making pie crust together in her kitchen in Flagstaff, that the women in our family had always done things their own way, and that she thought I was going to be fine. I wanted to see her. I did not particularly want to see Phyllis. I wrote back to Bradford, "Thanks for the heads up, I'll be there." He responded with a thumbs up emoji, which is honestly peak Bradford. The event was on a Saturday afternoon in late October, which in Scottsdale means the brutal heat has broken and you can actually exist outside without suffering. Uncle Ray had strung lights across the backyard and set up long tables, and hired a catering company to handle the food, which was a level of investment that told me Phyllis had been involved in the planning. I drove up from Phoenix, where I'd been staying for a week to meet with 2 local clients in person. I'd timed it deliberately, arrive at the party with somewhere I'd just come from, somewhere I'd need to be afterward. Not because I was going to be defensive about any of it, but because having a shape to my schedule made me feel less like I was walking into the thing unprepared. I wore a blue dress I'd bought 2 years earlier and rarely had occasion to wear. I brought a card from my grandmother with a photo I'd had printed, the 2 of us at her kitchen table, the pie crust photo, blown up and framed small enough to carry in my bag. Grandma Eloise saw me from across the yard and came toward me with her arms already open, and for a moment nothing else in the whole afternoon mattered at all. She held my face in her hands and said, "There she is," and I thought if I could just stay in this specific moment forever, I would be a very contented person. Then I heard Phyllis's voice behind her. "She's been waiting for you," Phyllis said, appearing at my grandmother's shoulder with a glass of white wine and a smile that was doing a lot of work. "We all have." She hugged me. The hug lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and no longer. "You look thin," she said, pulling back to look at me. "Are you eating?" "I'm great, thank you." "Good, good." She looked me over with a quick, efficient assessment of someone cataloging information for later use. "Bradford's over by the grill. He just got back from a conference in Denver. He's doing incredibly well." "That's great," I said. "Regional director now, you know. They gave him a team of 42 people. She set the number specifically, the way you cite a statistic. He's really found his footing. It's so good to see." I nodded. I excused myself to go find my mother. The afternoon went the way these things go, which is to say it was mostly fine, and occasionally not fine, and you never quite knew when you were going to step from one into the other. I talked to my grandmother for a long time, and she asked real questions and listened to the answers. I talked to cousins I liked and avoided ones I didn't. I ate good food, which I'd known I would because Phyllis, whatever her other qualities, does not do anything halfway when she's running an event. And then we moved to the patio for the part of the afternoon where people said things about Grandma Eloise, and someone had set up a little microphone situation and people were taking turns sharing memories, and it was genuinely lovely. Until it became a round robin of updates. I'm not sure how it happened exactly. One person segued from a memory into a life update and then it spread, the way these things do, until everyone was talking about what they were up to and where things were headed. A cousin had just bought a house. An uncle had retired early. Another cousin was starting law school. And then Phyllis spoke. She talked about Bradford for about 4 minutes, which I know because I watched the time. She covered the promotion, the team size, the conference in Denver, and then, and this is the part that made my stomach do something specific, she mentioned that Bradford was in the running for a VP role at a firm in Dallas. "We're very hopeful," she said. "He's exactly what they're looking for." She beamed at Bradford, who was standing near the grill with the self-consciousness of someone who knows they're being talked about. Then she looked at me. It was a brief look. The kind that's designed to look casual and isn't. "And what about you?" she said, in a tone that was warmth adjacent but not quite warm. "What are you up to these days?" The patio went a little quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough. "Still doing the marketing thing?" she added, helpfully. I looked at her. I'd thought about this moment, or some version of it, for 8 years. I'd imagined what I would say. I'd imagined being witty or cutting or calm. I'd imagined having the perfect answer delivered in the perfect tone. What I actually felt, standing there in my blue dress with my glass of iced tea, was something closer to tired. Not sad tired. Just done with this particular game tired. Actually, I said yes, still doing the marketing thing. She waited. She was hoping I would stop there, I think. That I'd give her the opening. "My agency has 17 full-time employees now," I said. "We closed out last fiscal year at just over $4 million in revenue. I'm actually here this week because we're opening a second office. We signed the lease on a space in Scottsdale on Thursday." Nobody said anything for a moment. My grandmother smiled. My mother, from 3 people to my left, exhaled in a way I recognized from childhood as pride. She was trying not to make too visible. "We also," I said, and I said this part very carefully, looking at Phyllis, "recently took on a new enterprise client. Large company, regional scope, Dallas-based." I paused. "They were referred to us through a colleague. We'll be handling their full digital presence starting Q1. Phyllis's expression was doing something I couldn't quite name. A kind of recalibration happening in real time. "The company's called Mercer Group," I said. "I believe Bradford interviewed with them last month." Here's what I need to explain, because this is the part that I did not plan and could not have predicted. 3 weeks before the party, my business development manager had come to me with a new lead. Regional retail company Dallas-based, looking for a full-service digital marketing partner. Good budget, serious timeline, ready to move. She'd been in conversation with their marketing director for 2 weeks. I hadn't connected the name immediately. Why would I? I never had reason to track Bradford's career moves with any specificity. It wasn't until I was sitting across from their VP of marketing at a coffee meeting in Phoenix, making small talk, and she'd mentioned that they were also interviewing candidates for a few senior roles. And she'd named the position, Regional Director of Business Operations, that something clicked instantly. I hadn't said anything then. I'd gone back to my office and pulled up Bradford's LinkedIn and looked at his profile and sat with the information for a long time. He had applied. His profile showed he'd recently switched his location preference to Dallas. The timeline matched. I thought about it, whether to say something, whether to tell someone, what the right thing was. Then I'd done my job. We'd put together a strong proposal, they'd loved it, and we'd signed the contract the week before the party. That part had nothing to do with Bradford. We'd won the business because we were the right fit. The other thing, whether Bradford got the job, was completely outside my hands. He'd applied before we'd been engaged. Our contract was with marketing, not HR. Those decisions don't touch each other. What I knew, standing on the patio, was simply that the company Phyllis had been celebrating for 4 minutes was a company that had signed a contract with me 4 days earlier. That Bradford had interviewed there. That Mercer Group's marketing director had told me on Thursday, when we'd finalized paperwork, that they filled their senior roles internally after reconsidering the scope. I hadn't sought this information. I hadn't shaped it. It had simply arrived. The patio was very quiet. Phyllis put her wine glass down on the table beside her. A careful, deliberate movement. Bradford looked at me from across the yard. I couldn't read his expression. My grandmother, bless her, reached over and put her hand on my arm. She said, "That is wonderful, sweetheart," in a voice that meant she understood exactly what was happening and had decided to be the room's weather system. "Tell me more about the Scottsdale office." So I did. I talked about the lease and the team we were building out and what it meant to have a presence closer to family. I spoke to my grandmother and let the rest of the conversation find its own level. Later, when people had started to drift toward the dessert table and the sun was getting low, Bradford came to find me. He was quieter than usual. He stood next to me for a moment, both of us looking at the string lights. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know," I said. "About any of it. The agency, the size of it." He paused. "I've been telling people you do social media for small businesses." "That's what your mother told me I should do," I said. "When I started." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." I looked at him. Bradford and I had shared a school bus for 6 years. We'd built a blanket fort in this very backyard when we were 9. Whatever our adulthood had made us to each other, we'd started out as kids who knew each other. "It's okay," I said, and I mostly meant it. "She's not going to handle this well," he said. "I know." She really believed. He stopped, started again. She needed to believe the story she was telling. About me. About you. He looked sideways at the table where Phyllis was sitting, talking to an aunt, her posture a little stiffer than it had been 2 hours earlier. I don't think she knew she was doing it. "Maybe not," I said. "Does it make it okay?" "No," I agreed. "It really doesn't." We stood there for another minute. The caterers were clearing the tables. My grandmother was laughing at something someone had said, her head thrown back, 75 years old and entirely herself. "Congratulations," Bradford said. "On all of it. I mean that." "Thank you," I said. "I hope Dallas works out somewhere." He half smiled. It was the most honest expression I'd seen on his face in a decade. Phyllis found me before I left, near the side gate where I'd parked. She was different than she'd been all afternoon. Quieter. She looked like she was working out how to say something she hadn't worked out yet. "I didn't realize how far you'd come," she said finally. I waited. "I suppose I had a picture of what you were doing and I didn't update it." It was about as close to an apology as Phyllis was capable of generating, and I understood that. I also understood that it was not quite an apology because it placed the problem in the picture rather than in the person who'd painted it. But I was standing next to my car in the warm October evening and my grandmother was inside having birthday cake and I had an office lease signed and a solid team and $4 million of work behind me. I did not need Phyllis to fully understand. "Thank you for saying that," I said, "and I meant that too, partially." She nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else. Maybe something about Bradford, about the Dallas job, about how things had worked out. She didn't. She just nodded again and went back inside. I drove back toward Phoenix with the windows down, the desert air coming in cool and dry. I thought about my grandmother saying there she is with her arms already open. I thought about Bradford at the fence, telling me he was sorry. I thought about 8 years of making something from nothing and the quiet, away from people who were keeping score. I had never needed them to see it. But I had thought about it, more than I'd admitted to myself. That moment when the picture they were carrying around would finally have to change. The thing nobody tells you is that when it finally happens, you mostly just feel relieved. Like a door you didn't know was still open finally clicking shut. I turned on the radio, I drove south through the dark. I was going to be absolutely fine, and I had known that for years. The nicest part was that now they knew it too. I keep thinking about Grandma Eloise's hands on my face when she said there she is. Not the moment on the patio. Not Phyllis going quiet. Just that, her palms, warm and certain, like she'd never once doubted I'd show up exactly as I was. That's the part I want to hold on to. The rest of it. The 8 years of being the cautionary tale, the Christmas questions, the Facebook posts about Bradford's promotions. I don't think any of that was malicious, exactly. I think Phyllis genuinely believed the story she was telling. She needed a map of the world where certain paths were safe and others were reckless, and she placed me firmly on the reckless side early on and never picked up the map again. That's not evil, it's just a failure of curiosity. A decision, made quietly and never revisited, to stop looking. What I've learned, and I mean really learned, not just understood intellectually, is that the people who underestimate you are usually not watching you closely enough to update their picture. They're busy, maintaining the story. And the story only breaks when reality becomes impossible to ignore. I didn't engineer that moment on the patio. I didn't go to Scottsdale looking to prove anything. I went because my grandmother was turning 75 and I loved her. The rest of it arrived on its own, the way things do when you've spent years doing the actual work instead of performing it. That's something I think about a lot now. The difference between building something and announcing that you're building it. For a long time, not telling people felt like a disadvantage. Like I was letting Phyllis win by default because she didn't know the score. But silence is also a kind of integrity. Every hour I spent on a client proposal instead of crafting a LinkedIn update about my journey was an hour that went directly into what I was making. You can't do both equally. You have to choose what you're feeding. And you have to be honest with yourself about your own motives. I stayed quiet partly because I didn't want to give Phyllis ammunition if things went wrong. That's not entirely noble, that's self-protection. I think real character is knowing the difference between your best reasons and your real ones, and acting well anyway. Bradford said something at the fence that I've turned over many times since. He said she needed to believe the story she was telling. About him too, not just about me. And I think that might be the saddest part of all of it. She was so busy building a monument to his potential that she never just let him be a person finding his way. That's its own kind of weight to carry, and it's not one he asked for. What gets you through the years when nobody's watching isn't confidence. Exactly. It's more like stubbornness in service of something you actually believe in. It's waking up at 4 in the morning to fix a pitch deck, not because someone's grading you, but because you said you would. It's making the decision, over and over, to care more about the work than about who's impressed by it. I drove back to Phoenix with the windows down, the desert was dark and enormous and entirely indifferent to all of it. And I was fine. I had been fine for a long time. That was the thing Phyllis's silence on the patio finally confirmed. Not that I'd won something, but that I'd never needed her to know in order to keep going. I already knew. That had always been enough.